Calculus professor tries to humiliate John Neely Kennedy without knowing he is a math genius. The pale morning light filtered through the towering arched windows of Fairmont University's neoclassical mathematics building, casting long, soft shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air carried the faint scent of old books and chalk dust, a reminder of the institution's storied academic legacy. Fairmont was a place where tradition weighed heavily, where the corridors echoed with the footsteps of brilliant minds and the ambitions of those hoping to join their ranks. In room 312 of the mathematics department, the first day of the semester was unfolding with a quiet buzz of anticipation. Students trickled in, their backpacks slung over shoulders, their faces a mix of nervous excitement and cautious dread. They were the best and brightest from across the country. Yet the pressure to prove themselves in this prestigious environment was palpable. The seats in the lecture hall filled slowly, the murmur of voices blending with the occasional creak of chairs and the rustle of notebooks being opened. At the center of the blackboard, written in crisp, authoritative white chalk, were the words, Advanced Calculus 1, Dr. Margaret Hensley. The name alone was enough to hush conversations and straighten postures. Hensley was a legend in her own right, a mathematician whose intellect was as sharp as a scalpel. Her reputation built on unrelenting rigor and an absolute intolerance for mediocrity. To her, a classroom was not a place for comfort or coddling. It was a battlefield where only the truly deserving survived. Mistakes were not just noted, they were dissected. Praise was as rare as a perfect proof, and even then, it came with a caveat to strive harder. The students knew this, and the weight of her expectations hung over the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. The door opened quietly, almost imperceptibly, and a man stepped inside. He drew no attention, blending into the background as effortlessly as a shadow. He wore a simple navy dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and neatly pressed khaki trousers. His hair, dark with a hint of gray at the temples, was slightly tousled, as if he'd just run a hand through it. He carried a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from use, and nothing, el seno laptop, no phone, no ostentatious accessories. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the room briefly before he moved to the back row and took a seat. This was John Neely Kennedy, the United States Senator from Louisiana, though no one would have guessed it from his unassuming demeanor. A few students glanced his way, their expressions flickering with recognition. Wasn't he the politician with the folksy southern drawl, the one known for witty speeches on the Senate floor? Whispers passed between two students in the middle row, but they kept their voices low, respecting the unspoken rule of the classroom. Don't disrupt the order. The curiosity was there, though why was a senator here, sitting among them in a calculus class? Was this a publicity stunt, a quirky campaign move, or something else entirely? No one dared approach him, but the glances lingered, filled with silent questions. Kennedy, for his part, seemed oblivious to the attention. He opened his notebook, pulled out a pen, and began jotting something down. His posture relaxed but focused, as if he were just another student preparing for the lecture. The door slammed shut with a force that silenced the room. Dr. Margaret Hensley entered, her presence as commanding as a general stepping onto a battlefield. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white blouse, her auburn hair pulled back into a severe bun that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor with a rhythm that was both deliberate and intimidating. She carried a slim leather briefcase, which she placed on the desk with a precision that suggested nothing in her world was ever out of place. Turning to face the class, she stood motionless for a moment, her piercing green eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing its prey. The students shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, some straightening in their seats, others looking down at their desks to avoid her scrutiny. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus," she said at last, her voice low and cold, each word enunciated with surgical precision. "This is not a place for the faint of heart. nor is it a playground for those who think effort alone is enough. Here, you will be tested not just on what you know, but on what you can do with what you know. There is no room for excuses, no tolerance for laziness, and no mercy for those who believe they can coast on charm or connections. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Hensley let it linger, her eyes moving from one student to the next, as if weighing their worth. At Fairmont University, we operate on merit, she continued, her tone sharpening. I don't care if your family name is on a building, if you graduated at the top of your high school class, or if you have 1 million followers on social media. What matters is your mind, your ability to think, to reason, to wrestle with the truth, and come out stronger for it. If you're not prepared to do that, you don't belong here. Her gaze shifted toward the back of the room, where Kennedy sat, his pen still moving across the page of his notebook. He didn't look up, didn't react, but there was something in the way he held himself calm, unshaken, that seemed to catch her attention. She paused, her lips tightening slightly, as if she'd just identified a target. Some of you, she said, her voice taking on a mocking edge, seem to think that a public persona can substitute for discipline, that a few clever sound bites or a well-placed smile can make up for a lack of substance. Let me be clear. In this classroom, fame is irrelevant. Politics, irrelevant. What matters is whether you can hold your own when the numbers don't lie. The provocation was unmistakable, aimed squarely at Kennedy. A few students turned their heads, stealing glances at him, expecting some kind of reaction, a flush of embarrassment, a defensive retort, anything. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He finished writing a line in his notebook, then looked up, his eyes meeting Hensley's for the briefest moment. There was no defiance in his expression, no anger, just a quiet intensity that seemed to say he'd heard her and chosen not to engage. The room held its breath, waiting for the next move in this unspoken chess game. Hensley, unfazed, turned back to the blackboard and began writing a series of equations, her chalk moving with the precision of a conductor's baton. The lecture launched into a discussion of limits and continuity, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of challenge, as if daring anyone to falter. The students scrambled to keep up, their pens scratching furiously as they tried to capture every word, every symbol. Kennedy followed along, his notes meticulous, his handwriting neat and deliberate. He didn't ask questions, didn't draw attention to himself. But there was something about the way he worked, methodical, almost meditative, that set him apart from the nervous energy of the others. As the lecture progressed, the tension in the room grew thicker, not because of the material, which was daunting but expected, but because of the dynamic unfolding between Hensley and the man in the back row. She moved through examples with ruthless efficiency, calling on students at random to test their understanding. Each time a student hesitated or stumbled, her response was a scalpel, cutting through their errors with a mix of logic and disdain. If you can't differentiate a basic function, what are you doing here? She snapped at one young man, who shrank back in his seat. The class was a gauntlet, and Hensley was its unrelenting gatekeeper. Yet her attention kept drifting to Kennedy, her eyes flicking toward him as if waiting for a misstep. He gave her none. He sat quietly, his focus unwavering, his notebook filling with diagrams and derivations that went beyond what she was presenting, as if he were already exploring the material's deeper implications. The lecture was nearing its end when Hensley paused, her chalk hovering over the board. She turned to the class, her expression unreadable but her intent clear. "Before we conclude," she said, "I'd like to offer an opportunity for someone to demonstrate their commitment to this course." She wrote a problem on the board, not one from the textbook, but a monstrous equation involving nested limits and partial derivatives. The kind of problem designed to intimidate even the most confident students. The room fell silent, the students staring at the board, with a mix of awe and dread. Would anyone care to try? she asked, her voice dripping with mock encouragement. No hands went up. The seconds ticked by, the silence growing heavier. Then, with a deliberate turn, she looked directly at Kennedy. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Since you've chosen to grace us with your presence, perhaps you'd like to show us what a senator can do with a real challenge. Or is calculus a bit too far from the campaign trail?" The room froze. Every eye turned to Kennedy, some with pity, others with curiosity, a few with barely concealed amusement. This was it, the moment Hensley had been building toward, the public test meant to expose him as an outsider, a dilettante playing at academia. The students waited, their breaths held, expecting him to deflect or decline. Kennedy looked at the board, his expression calm, almost contemplative. He closed his notebook slowly, as if weighing his options, then met Hensley's gaze. "I'll give it a look next class, if that's all right," he said, his voice steady, his southern drawl soft but clear. "I'd like to make sure I'm respecting your time and the class's." It was a polite deflection, but there was something in his tone, confident, unshaken, that shifted the room's energy. Hensley's eyes narrowed, but she nodded curtly. "Very well," she said, turning back to the board. "We'll see what you're made of." The bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture, but the tension lingered like static in the air. Students gathered their things, their whispers louder now, speculating about what had just happened. Did he just dodge that? Or is he actually going to try? One student muttered to her friend. "He didn't seem fazed at all," another replied, stealing a glance at Kennedy as he packed up. He moved with the same quiet purpose he'd shown all class, slipping his notebook into his bag and heading for the door. A few students lingered, watching him go, their curiosity now tinged with something else, anticipation. They sensed that this was only the beginning, that the man in the back row was not what he seemed. Hensley, meanwhile, stood at the front of the room, erasing the board with quick, forceful strokes. Her face was a mask of control, but her movements betrayed a flicker of unease. She had thrown down the gauntlet, expecting an easy victory. But Kennedy's response or lack thereof had left her with more questions than answers. As the last students filed out, the room fell silent, the echoes of the lecture fading into the walls. Room 312 was no longer just a classroom. It was a stage. And the drama that had begun today was far from over. The next class loomed on the horizon, promising a confrontation that would test not just knowledge, but character. And John Neely Kennedy, with his unassuming demeanor and unyielding calm, was about to show Fairmont University that he was no ordinary student and no ordinary man. The lecture hall in room 312 of Fairmont University's mathematics building was unusually full, the air thick, with a restless energy that hadn't been there the first day. Word of the tense exchange between Dr. Margaret Hensley and John Neely Kennedy had spread like wildfire across campus, whispered in dorm rooms, debated in the library, and dissected over coffee in the student union. Students who weren't even enrolled in advanced calculus I had slipped into the back rows, their notebooks unopened, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. The room, with its high ceilings and rows of worn wooden desks, felt less like a classroom and more like an arena. The kind where gladiators faced off not with swords but with intellect and resolve. The blackboard loomed at the front, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with equations or perhaps with the fallout of a battle that had been brewing since Hensley's pointed challenge. The students who were enrolled arrived early, their usual nervous chatter replaced by a hushed anticipation. They took their seats, glancing toward the back row where Kennedy had sat last time, wondering if he'd show up after Hensley's public jab. The question wasn't just whether he'd return, but whether he'd dare to step into the trap she'd so carefully laid. The door creaked open, and Kennedy walked in, as unassuming as before. He wore a charcoal sweater over a white-collared shirt, his khaki trousers pressed but not flashy, his leather notebook tucked under one arm. His face betrayed no hint of the pressure that must have followed him, no trace of the whispers that had turned him into the campus's latest fascination. He moved with the same quiet purpose, his steps measured, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on his usual seat in the last row. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, some of recognition, others of surprise. "He's back!" a student whispered to her friend, who nodded, her eyes wide. Kennedy sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and opened his notebook, his pen moving across the page, as if the weight of 100 curious stares didn't exist. The other students watched him, some discreetly, others openly, trying to reconcile the image of the folksy senator they'd seen on news clips with the man now sitting among them, preparing for a calculus lecture. What was he doing here, really? Was he about to crash and burn? Or was there something more to him? Something none of them had anticipated. The door slammed shut with a force that cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Doctor." Margaret Hensley strode in, her presence as commanding as ever. But there was a new edge to her demeanor, a sharpness that suggested she was not just teaching a class but waging a campaign. Her tailored navy suit was impeccable, her auburn hair pulled back with such precision it seemed to defy movement. She carried her briefcase with the same deliberate care, setting it on the desk with a soft thud that echoed in the silent room. She didn't look at the class immediately. Instead, she turned to the blackboard and began writing, her chalk moving with a furious intensity. The symbols that appeared were not the familiar ones from the syllabus, no simple derivatives or limits here. This was a beast of an equation. A sprawling tangle of integrals, partial derivatives, and number theory constructs that seemed to defy comprehension. The students stared, their pens frozen above their notebooks, their faces a mix of awe and dread. This wasn't a problem from their textbook or lecture notes. It was something else entirely. A gauntlet thrown down with a single purpose. Hensley stepped back, her chalk still in hand, and turned to face the class. Her eyes were cold, her expression unreadable, but there was a glint of something predatory in her gaze. "Good morning," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I trust you've all prepared for today's lecture, though I suspect many of you are still grappling with the basics of what we covered last time. Let me remind you, this is advanced calculus. If you're here to coast, you're in the wrong place." She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes sweeping the room before landing, inevitably, on Kennedy. He sat quietly, his pen still moving, his face betraying no reaction to her scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that seemed to tighten with every second. "Today," Hensley continued, her tone taking on a mocking edge, "we're going to explore something a bit more illuminating. This problem," she gestured to the blackboard, where the equation loomed like a fortress, the kind of challenge that separates those who belong here from those who are merely passing through. It's not in your textbook, it's not in your study guides. It's a test of whether you can think, not just regurgitate. The students shifted uncomfortably, some scribbling the equation in a futile attempt to make sense of it, others staring blankly, already defeated. Hensley let the silence stretch, her eyes never leaving Kennedy. "Would anyone care to try?" she asked, her voice dripping with false encouragement. No hands went up. The seconds ticked by, the room so quiet you could hear the faint scratch of a pen from the front row. Then, with a deliberate turn, she fixed her gaze on Kennedy. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the tension, "you were so kind as to promise us a demonstration last class. Since you seem so eager to contribute, why don't you show us what you're capable of? Or is this a bit too complex for someone more accustomed to stump speeches than Stokes' theorem?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some students turned to look at Kennedy, their expressions a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Others kept their eyes down, as if afraid to witness what was about to happen. This was no ordinary challenge. It was a public execution, a calculated move to expose Kennedy as an interloper in Hensley's domain. The equation on the board was a monster, designed to humiliate even the brightest in the class, let alone a politician with no known academic credentials in mathematics. The room waited, the air heavy with expectation, for Kennedy to back down, to offer an excuse, to retreat. But Kennedy didn't retreat. He looked at the board, his eyes tracing the equation with a calm intensity that seemed out of place in the charged atmosphere. He closed his notebook slowly, the sound of the leather cover snapping shut, cutting through the silence. Then, with a measured grace, he stood and began walking toward the front of the room. The students watched, some leaning forward, others exchanging stunned glances. "He's actually going," a student whispered, her voice barely audible. Kennedy moved with no trace of drama, no hint of bravado, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. When he reached the board, he paused, not touching the chalk yet, his eyes moving over the equation as if reading a map only he could see. Hensley took a step back, her arms crossed, her face a mask of smug certainty. She was ready to watch him falter, to see her trap spring shut. Kennedy picked up a piece of chalk, rolling it between his fingers for a moment before turning to the board. "This is a nested integral with a number theory twist," he said softly, his southern drawl lending a disarming warmth to his words. "It looks intimidating, but it's really about finding the pattern beneath the noise." He began writing, not in the middle of the equation as most students might have, but in a corner of the board, sketching out a framework that seemed to contextualize the problem. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, each symbol placed with care. "The trick here," he continued, circling a section of the equation, "is to recognize that the integral's structure is hiding a convergence pattern. If you treat this term as a function rather than a fixed value, you start to see the path." The students leaned in, their pens moving now, not to copy the equation but to capture his explanation. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an authority to it, a clarity that made the impossible seem approachable. He worked methodically, breaking the problem into smaller pieces, each step accompanied by an explanation that was both precise and accessible. "Think of it like a river," he said, drawing a smooth curve to illustrate a function's behavior. "The water doesn't just flow, it follows the shape of the land. This integral is the same. It's shaped by the constraints around it." A few students nodded, their faces lighting up with understanding. One, a quiet girl in the second row who rarely spoke, raised her hand hesitantly. "So, the limit doesn't exist unless you adjust the domain, right?" she asked, her voice tentative. Kennedy turned to her, a faint smile crossing his face. "Exactly," he said. "You're seeing the shape of the land. That's what this is about." The girl blushed, but her eyes shone with a newfound confidence. The room was no longer silent. There were murmurs now, not of doubt but of awe. Students who had been lost in the equation's complexity were following along, their notebooks filling with diagrams and notes, inspired by Kennedy's approach. He didn't just solve the problem, he translated it, turning abstract symbols into something tangible, almost intuitive. He referenced concepts from analysis and number theory, weaving them together with a fluency that belied his public persona as a politician. At one point, he paused to draw a parallel to his work in the Senate. "This is like drafting a bill," he said, his tone light but earnest. "You've got all these moving parts, amendments, clauses, competing interests. If you don't see the underlying structure, you're just making noise. Math is the same. Find the structure, and the rest falls into place." The class laughed, the tension easing for a moment, but the respect in their eyes was unmistakable. Hensley stood motionless, her arms still crossed, her face a study in control. But her eyes betrayed her there was a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the armor of her confidence. She had expected Kennedy to flounder, to expose himself as a fraud. Instead, he was dismantling her challenge with a precision that was both humbling and infuriating. He moved through the final steps of the solution, his chalk tracing the last few symbols with a quiet finality. The answer glowed on the board, not because it was flashy, but because it was right, elegant, inevitable, true. He stepped back, placing the chalk on the ledge, and turned to the class. "That's one way to look at it," he said simply. "There are others, but this gets you to the heart of it." The room erupted in applause, not polite, not forced, but genuine, the kind that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. Students clapped, some standing, others exchanging stunned looks. "That was incredible," a student in the front row muttered, shaking his head. The girl who had asked the question was beaming, her notebook open to a page, filled with sketches, inspired by Kennedy's explanation. Even the interlopers in the back, who had come for the spectacle, were clapping, their skepticism replaced by admiration. Kennedy didn't bask in the moment. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and began walking back to his seat, his demeanor as unassuming as when he'd entered. Hensley remained where she was, her face unreadable, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The applause was a rebuke, not of her teaching, but of her assumptions. She had misjudged Kennedy, and the entire class had seen it. Without a word, she stepped forward and began erasing the board, her movements quick and forceful, the chalk dust falling like a silent accusation. "Let's move on," she said, her voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil that must have been churning inside her. She launched into the scheduled lecture, her tone clipped, her examples mechanical. But the magic was gone. The students' eyes kept drifting to Kennedy, who had reopened his notebook and was jotting down notes, his focus unshaken by the moment he'd just created. As the lecture ended, the room buzzed with a new kind of energy. Students lingered, some approaching Kennedy hesitantly, their questions not about the lecture but about the problem he'd solved. "How did you know to start with the convergence pattern?" one asked, his voice tinged with awe. Kennedy smiled, his drawl softening the moment. "You just keep asking questions till the problem starts answering back," he said. And the student laughed, nodding as if he'd just been handed a secret. Others hovered nearby, not bold enough to speak, but eager to listen. The interlopers slipped out, already texting their friends about what they'd seen. The video of Kennedy's performance, captured by a student's phone, was already making its way across campus, destined to become a legend in its own right. Hensley gathered her things quickly, her movements precise but hurried. She didn't look at Kennedy as she left, but her silence spoke volumes. The board was clean now, the evidence of her challenge erased, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the room, in the students' eyes, in the air itself. Kennedy packed up last, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression as calm as ever. But something had shifted. He wasn't just the senator anymore, not just the curiosity who'd wandered into a calculus class. He was something else, something the students couldn't quite define, but something they wanted to understand. And as he walked out of room 312, the door closing softly behind him, one thing was clear. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The lecture hall in room 312 at Fairmont University had transformed into something more than a classroom. It was now a crucible where egos, intellects, and expectations collided. The viral video of John Neely Kennedy's masterful dismantling of Dr. Margaret Hensley's monstrous equation had turned the Advanced Calculus 1 course into a campus phenomenon. Students from other departments, physics, economics, even literature, crowded the back of the room, standing against the walls or sitting cross-legged on the floor, their phones discreetly angled to capture whatever might unfold. The air was electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that precedes a storm. The enrolled students, once timid under Hensley's iron rule, now arrived with notebooks open and eyes sharp, their curiosity about Kennedy outweighing their fear of the professor's wrath. Whispers had given way to open speculation. Was Kennedy a secret math prodigy? Was he here to upstage Hensley? Or was there something deeper driving him? The blackboard, wiped clean from the last class, stood like a blank stage, waiting for the next act in this unfolding drama. The question on everyone's mind was not what Hensley would teach, but how she would respond to the man who had, without trying, stolen her spotlight. Kennedy entered quietly, just minutes before the lecture was set to begin, his presence as understated as ever. He wore a simple gray blazer over a white shirt, his leather notebook tucked under his arm, its worn edges a stark contrast to the sleek laptops and tablets of his classmates. His face betrayed no hint of the campus buzz that had turned him into a legend overnight. He moved to his usual seat in the back row, nodding politely to a student who offered a shy smile. The room watched him, some openly, others stealing glances, their expressions a mix of admiration and curiosity. A few whispered to each other, their voices low but excited. "Did you see the video? He made that equation look easy," one said. "Yeah, but Hensley's not going to let that slide," another replied, glancing toward the door. Kennedy opened his notebook, his pen moving across the page, with the same calm focus he'd shown before, as if the weight of the room's attention was irrelevant. But the students sensed something different about him today, not arrogance. Not showmanship, but a quiet readiness, like a chess player preparing for a critical move. The door opened not with the usual slam, but with a slow, deliberate creak. Dr. Margaret Hensley stepped inside, her posture as impeccable as ever, but there was a tightness to her movements, a controlled intensity that hadn't been there before. Her tailored black dress was severe, her auburn hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She carried her briefcase with a grip that suggested it was an anchor in a storm. The room fell silent, the students' eyes darting between her and Kennedy, sensing the confrontation that had been brewing since the last class. Hensley set her briefcase on the desk, her movements precise, but slower than usual, as if she were measuring each action. She didn't look at the class immediately. Instead, she turned to the blackboard and began writing, her chalk moving with a fierce determination. The symbols that appeared were dense and intricate, a problem involving vector fields and differential forms, layered with constraints that seemed designed to confound even the most advanced students. The equation grew, sprawling across the board like a labyrinth, its complexity a silent challenge to anyone who dared engage with it. Hensley stepped back, her chalk still in hand, and turned to face the class. Her eyes were cold, but there was a fire behind them, a determination to reclaim her authority. "Today," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "we're diving into the mathematics of motion and change vector fields and their gradients. This is not a game for amateurs. If you're not prepared to think beyond the surface, you're wasting everyone's time." Her words were sharp, but there was an undercurrent of something personal, a barb aimed not at the class but at one man in particular. She gestured to the board, where the equation loomed like a fortress. "This problem is a test of clarity and precision. It requires not just knowledge, but insight, the kind that comes from years of discipline, not from fleeting moments of inspiration." Her eyes flicked to Kennedy, who sat quietly. His pen paused above his notebook, his gaze fixed on the board. The room held its breath, sensing the moment she'd been building toward. "Mr. Kennedy," Hensley said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "since you've shown such enthusiasm for contributing, perhaps you'd like to walk us through this problem." But let's make it interesting. She glanced at her watch, then back at him. You have 10 minutes to solve it and explain it to the class. No notes, no preparation. Just you and the board. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to sit this one out. The challenge was brutal. Its terms designed to expose any weakness. 10 minutes was barely enough to parse the problem, let alone solve it. And the added pressure of explaining it in front of a packed room was a masterstroke of intimidation. The students gasped, some turning to look at Kennedy, others whispering in disbelief. She's trying to bury him, a student muttered, shaking his head. Hensley crossed her arms, her face a mask of smug certainty, confident that this time Kennedy would falter. Kennedy didn't react immediately. He looked at the board, his eyes tracing the equation with a calm intensity that seemed to quiet the room. Then, slowly, he closed his notebook and stood, his movements unhurried, almost serene. The students watched, their whispers fading into silence, as he walked to the front of the room. There was no drama in his stride, no hint of bravado, just the quiet purpose of someone who saw the challenge, not as a trap, but as an opportunity. When he reached the board, he paused, studying the equation for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the chalk ledge. Hensley took a step back, her arms still crossed, her eyes locked on him like a hawk watching its prey. The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Kennedy picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the class, his southern drawl soft but clear. "This problem's a beauty," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's about how things move. And interact vector fields are like the rules of a dance, telling you where to step and when. Let's see if we can make it sing." The students leaned in, their pens poised, caught off guard by his warmth and confidence. He began writing, not diving into the equation's core, but sketching a diagramma, simple grid, with arrows flowing in different directions. "Think of this as a map," he said, pointing to the arrows. "Each one's a force, pushing or pulling. The trick is figuring out how they work together." His voice was steady, almost hypnotic, as he broke the problem into pieces, each step accompanied by an explanation that was both rigorous and relatable. He didn't just solve, he narrated, turning abstract mathematics into a story the class could follow. "See this term here?" he said, circling a section of the equation. "It's trying to throw you off, like a curveball in a negotiation. But if you rewrite it using a change of coordinates, it starts to behave." He drew a new diagram, his chalk moving with a fluid grace, transforming the problem's complexity into something visual, almost intuitive. The students scribbled furiously, their faces lighting up as connections clicked. A boy in the third row, who had barely spoken all semester, raised his hand. "So, it's like optimizing a system, like in economics?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Kennedy turned to him, nodding. "Exactly," he said. "Math's just a language for understanding systems, whether it's a market, a machine, or a law. You're getting it." The boy grinned, his shoulders relaxing, as if Kennedy's words had unlocked something inside him. Kennedy's approach was unconventional, blending rigorous analysis with real-world analogies. He drew parallels to his work in the Senate, comparing the problem's constraints to the competing interests in a budget debate. "You've got to balance what's possible with what's ideal," he said, sketching a graph that showed the vector field's behavior. "This equation's the same, it's telling you what's possible, but you've got to listen to it." The class laughed, the tension easing, but the respect in their eyes grew. He referenced concepts from differential geometry and physics, weaving them together with a fluency that stunned even the interlopers in the back. At one point, he paused to tell a brief story about a Louisiana river, its currents shaped by unseen forces. "That's what we're doing here," he said, pointing to the board. We're mapping the currents, finding the path. The 10-minute mark approached, but Kennedy was already nearing the solution. He wrote the final steps with a quiet confidence, his chalk tracing symbols that resolved the equation into a clear, elegant answer. He stepped back, placing the chalk on the ledge, and turned to the class. "That's the map," he said simply. "But the real trick is knowing why it matters. This isn't just numbers, it's how we understand motion, change, the world." The room erupted in applause, louder than the last class, the sound swelling as students stood, their faces alight with excitement. "I actually get it now," a girl in the front row whispered to her friend, her notebook filled with sketches inspired by Kennedy's diagrams. The interlopers clapped too, their phones still recording, already planning to share the moment with the world. Hensley stood frozen, her arms still crossed, her face a mask of control, but her eyes betrayed her there was no smugness now, only a flicker of something raw, something vulnerable. She had expected Kennedy to fail, to prove her point. Instead, he had turned her challenge into a lesson that resonated with every person in the room. The applause was a rebuke, not of her intellect, but of her intent. She cleared her throat, stepping forward as the clapping died down. "Thank you, Mr. Kennedy," she said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. "That was informative. Let's move on." She turned to the board and began erasing his work, her movements quick and forceful, the chalk dust falling like a curtain over the moment. But the class wasn't ready to move on. The students' eyes kept drifting to Kennedy, who had returned to his seat and reopened his notebook, his focus unshaken. Hensley launched into the scheduled lecture, her voice sharper than usual, her examples delivered with a mechanical precision that lacked her usual fire. The magic was gone, replaced by a tension that pulsed through the room. Then, in a moment that stunned everyone, she stopped mid-sentence and turned to Kennedy. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger, "you seem to enjoy playing the hero. Is this a performance? A new campaign strategy? Because this is my classroom, and I won't have it turned into a stage for your theatrics." The accusation hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, a direct attack on his motives. The room froze. Students exchanged glances, some shocked, others uncomfortable. Kennedy looked up, his expression calm but not passive. He closed his notebook slowly, his eyes meeting Hensley's with a quiet intensity. "With respect, Professor," he said, his drawl soft but unwavering. "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to learn, same as everyone else. You challenged me publicly, and I answered. If that helps the class understand, isn't that the point of teaching? Math's not a stage, it's a tool to lift folks up, not tear them down." His words were measured, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. A few students nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of agreement and awe. One whispered, "He's right," her voice barely audible. The door opened, and the room's tension spiked. "Dr. Evelyn Carter, the dean of the mathematics department, stepped inside, her presence unexpected but commanding. She was a tall woman with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the scene. "I heard this class has been dynamic," she said, her tone neutral, but with a hint of amusement. "Mind if I observe?" Hensley nodded stiffly, her face a mask of control, but her hands betrayed her, clenching tightly at her sides. The dean took a seat near the door, her gaze moving between Hensley and Kennedy, as if sensing the undercurrents that had brought the room to this moment. Hensley resumed her lecture, but her voice was strained, her rhythm off. The students listened, but their attention kept drifting to Kennedy, who sat quietly, his notebook open, his pen moving again. The dean watched, her expression unreadable. But her presence was a silent reminder that this confrontation had consequences beyond the classroom. As the lecture ended, students lingered, some approaching Kennedy with questions, others simply wanting to be near him. "That river analogy, can you explain it again?" a student asked, his voice eager. Kennedy smiled, nodding, and began sketching in the student's notebook, his explanations as clear and engaging as they'd been at the board. Hensley gathered her things, her movements quick and precise, but she paused at the door, glancing back at Kennedy. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them, not resolution, not surrender, but a recognition that this was a turning point. She left without a word, her heels clicking down the hall, the sound fading into the distance. The dean lingered, watching Kennedy interact with the students, a faint smile crossing her face before she too departed. Room 312 was quiet now, but the echoes of what had happened lingered, a promise that the next class would bring something new, something that would test not just knowledge, but character. And John Neely Kennedy, with his unassuming demeanor and unshakable resolve, was at the heart of it all. Room 312 at Fairmont University was no longer just a lecture hall. It had become a beacon, a place where something extraordinary was unfolding. The confrontation between Dr. Margaret Hensley and John Neely Kennedy had reshaped the Advanced Calculus 1 course into a campus legend, drawing students, faculty, and even curious alumni to its doors. The viral video of Kennedy's elegant solution and his calm, piercing response to Hensley's accusations had spread beyond the university, sparking debates on social media about teaching, humility, and the power of knowledge. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere was charged with a quiet reverence, as if everyone knew they were witnessing a transformation not just of a course, but of the people within it. The blackboard, once a symbol of Hensley's unchallenged authority, now felt like a shared canvas, a space where ideas could breathe and grow. Students arrived early, their notebooks open, their faces alight with anticipation. The interlopers from other departments still lingered, but their presence was less about spectacle and more about a genuine desire to learn. The question on everyone's mind was not whether Kennedy would rise to another challenge, but how he and Hensley would navigate the fragile new dynamic that had emerged after their public clash. Kennedy entered as he always did, quietly and without fanfare. His worn leather notebook tucked under his arm. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt, his khaki trousers pressed but unpretentious, his demeanor as unassuming as ever. The room watched him, but the stares were different, now less curious, more respectful, as if he'd earned a place among them not through fame, but through something deeper. He took his seat in the back row, nodding to a student who offered a hesitant wave. The class buzzed with a soft energy, students whispering about the last lecture, about Kennedy's river analogy, about the way he'd turned Hensley's trap into a lesson that made them feel capable. A few glanced toward the door, waiting for Hensley, wondering if she'd doubled down on her authority or if something had shifted within her. The memory of her accusation calling Kennedy a performer and his measured response hung in the air, an unresolved chord waiting for its resolution. The door opened, and Dr. Margaret Hensley stepped inside. Her entrance was quieter than usual, lacking the commanding force that had once silenced the room. She wore a tailored gray dress, her auburn hair still pulled back, but there was a softness to her posture, a subtle vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Her briefcase landed on the desk with a gentle thud, and she paused, her hands resting on its surface as if grounding herself. The students watched, their whispers fading, sensing that something was different. Hensley looked out at the class, her green eyes scanning the room, but they no longer carried the predatory glint of a commander. Instead, there was a flicker of introspection, a hint that the events of the past weeks had left their mark. She didn't turn to the blackboard immediately. Instead, she stood at the front, her silence drawing every eye to her. "Before we begin," Hensley said, her voice steady but softer than usual, "I need to address what's happened in this class." The room went still, the students exchanging glances, their pens frozen above their notebooks. Her words were deliberate, each one chosen with care. "I've spent years teaching with one goal: to push you to your limits, to demand excellence, to ensure that only the best survive. But I've realized I've made mistakes." The admission hung in the air, raw and unexpected, like a crack in a fortress wall. A few students leaned forward, their eyes wide, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Hensley's gaze moved to the back row, where Kennedy sat, his notebook open, his expression calm but attentive. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her voice catching slightly, "I owe you an apology. I let pride cloud my purpose. I challenged you not to teach, but to prove a point. And in doing so, I lost sight of what this classroom is for." The silence was profound, the kind that follows a revelation. Students glanced at Kennedy, then back at Hensley, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and respect. Kennedy nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding. Hensley took a breath, steadying herself, and continued. "You've shown me and all of us that teaching isn't about control. It's about connection, about making the complex clear, about lifting others up. For that, I thank you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated through the room. A few students clapped softly, not out of obligation, but out of genuine appreciation. Others nodded, their faces alight with a new kind of hope. Hensley stepped to the side, her posture less rigid now, and gestured to the blackboard. "Mr. Kennedy," she said, her voice warmer, "I'd like to propose something. Would you consider collaborating with me on future lessons? I believe we could create something powerful together. Your clarity, my rigor. Not as teacher and guest, but as partners in this space." The offer was unprecedented. A public olive branch from a woman who had built her career on unyielding authority. The students gasped, some whispering to each other, their excitement palpable. Kennedy looked at her, his expression thoughtful, as if weighing the gravity of her words. Then he stood, his movements unhurried, and walked to the front of the room, the class watching in rapt silence. "I'd be honored," Kennedy said, his southern drawl soft but clear, "but only if we do it as equals. This isn't about one of us leading, it's about the students, about helping them see what's possible." He turned to the class, a faint smile crossing his face. "Y'all are the reason we're here. Let's make this worth your time." The room erupted in applause, louder than any before, the sound swelling with gratitude and excitement. Students stood, some clapping, others cheering, their faces alight with a shared sense of purpose. Hensley smiled a genuine smile. The first the class had seen and nodded, her eyes meeting Kennedy's with a newfound respect. From that moment, room 312 became something new. Hensley began the lecture, diving into the theory of multivariable calculus with her usual precision. But her tone was differentless, like a commander, more like a guide. She explained concepts with clarity, pausing to ask questions, inviting students to share their thoughts. When the material grew dense, she turned to Kennedy, who stepped to the board with a quiet confidence. He didn't dominate. He complemented, using simple diagrams and analogies to make the abstract tangible. "Think of a gradient like a compass," he said, sketching a vector field that flowed like a river. "It points you to the steepest path, but you've got to decide how to climb." The students nodded, their pens moving, their faces reflecting understanding rather than fear. A girl in the front row, who had once struggled to keep up, raised her hand. "So, it's like choosing the best strategy in a debate?" she asked, her voice tentative. Kennedy grinned, nodding. Exactly. You're reading the terrain, picking the path that gets you where you need to go. The girl beamed, her confidence visibly growing. Their collaboration was seamless, a dance of intellect and empathy. Hensley provided the structure, the rigorous proofs, the mathematical scaffolding. Kennedy brought the color, the context, the stories that made the numbers come alive. He spoke of drafting legislation, of navigating complex systems, of finding patterns in chaos anecdote, a bridge between the classroom and the world beyond. The students responded with a hunger for learning that hadn't been there before. Questions came freely, even from those who had once sat in silence, afraid of Hensley's judgment. A boy who had failed the first quiz asked Kennedy to explain a concept again, and Kennedy sat beside him after class, sketching diagrams until the boy's eyes lit up with understanding. "I get it now," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I actually get it." The transformation wasn't limited to the students. Hensley began to change, her lectures incorporating more open discussion, her feedback less cutting, more constructive. She listened when students struggled, adjusting her approach to meet them where they were. One day, she brought in a problem inspired by Kennedy's analogies, asking the class to model a river's flow using vector fields. The students dove in, their enthusiasm infectious, their solutions creative and varied. Hensley watched, her face softening, as if she were rediscovering the joy of teaching. Kennedy, for his part, never moved from the back row except when invited to the board. He didn't seek the spotlight, didn't ask for recognition, but his presence was a catalyst, a reminder that knowledge was a gift to be shared, not a weapon to wield. The university took notice. The math department, long known for its rigid pedagogy, began revisiting its teaching models. Professors attended Hensley's lectures, taking notes on her and Kennedy's approach, incorporating visualization and storytelling into their own classes. The curriculum was updated, integrating collaborative projects and student-led discussions. Other departments followed suit, inspired by the buzz around room 312. The dean, Dr. Evelyn Carter, visited again, this time to meet with Hensley and Kennedy privately. "You've started something here," she said, her voice warm but serious. "This could change how we teach, not just at Fairmont, but beyond." Kennedy smiled, deflecting the praise. "It's the students doing the real work," he said. "We're just clearing the path." The impact was most profound in the students themselves. Those who had once dreaded calculus now thrived, their grades improving, their confidence soaring. A freshman who had considered dropping the course approached Kennedy after class, her voice nervous but determined. "Why do you always sit in the back?" she asked. "You could be up front, teaching with Dr. Hensley." Kennedy looked at her, his eyes kind. "Because from the back, you see who needs help the most," he said. "Teaching's not about standing out. It's about making sure everyone gets to the finish line." The girl nodded, her eyes shining, as if his words had given her permission to believe in herself. The semester drew to a close, but the legacy of room 312 endured. The final lecture was standing room only, with students and faculty filling every corner, their applause for Hensley and Kennedy a testament to what they'd built together. Hensley spoke first, thanking the class for their courage and curiosity, her voice steady but emotional. Kennedy followed, his words simple but profound. "Math's a language for understanding the world," he said. "But the real privilege isn't knowing it. It's using it to help others see what's possible." The room erupted in applause, the sound carrying out into the halls, a celebration of a journey that had changed them all. As the students filed out, some lingered to shake Kennedy's hand, others to thank Hensley, their gratitude palpable. A quiet boy, who had barely spoken all semester, approached Kennedy, holding out a notebook filled with sketches inspired by his analogies. "This is for you," he said, his voice shy. Kennedy took it, his smile genuine. "You keep it," he said. "You're the one making the maps now." The boy grinned, clutching the notebook like a treasure. Hensley and Kennedy stood at the front as the room emptied. Their partnership, a quiet triumph. "You've changed this place," Hensley said, her voice low. "And me." Kennedy shook his head, his drawl soft. "We did it together," he said. "That's what matters." They parted with a nod, a shared understanding that their work wasn't finished, that the lessons of room 312 would ripple outward, shaping minds and hearts for years to come. Kennedy walked out of the classroom, his notebook under his arm, his steps as unhurried as ever. The halls of Fairmont University were quiet now, but they carried a new energy, a promise of what education could be when it was rooted in humility and shared purpose. And John Neely Kennedy, the senator who had come to learn, left behind a legacy that would outlast any equaziona reminder that the true power of knowledge lies in lifting others up so that everyone can rise.